The fateful beginning. Melissa Carter was a 34-year-old marketing executive living in the bustling city of Denver, Colorado. Life had never felt more settled or complete. Her days started in the sun-drenched kitchen of their craftsman-style home, where she'd watch her husband Tom read the morning paper and her 6-year-old son, Ethan, clumsily spoon cereal while recounting his wild dreams. The Carters were, by all appearances, the kind of close-knit, happy family Melissa had always hoped to build. Melissa's roots weren't always this deep. She came from a modest background in small-town Nebraska, where resilience and keeping family close were values instilled from childhood. Her move to Denver after college was an act of ambition, and maybe a little rebellion. But over the years, she had carefully woven her own tapestry of stability, warmth, and love. Tom's family was bigger and noisier. Sunday barbecues, holiday dinners, stretching long into the night. Inside jokes flying over platters of food. Melissa was welcomed in as a daughter, and she prided herself on nurturing these connections. Tom's younger brother, Josh, was charismatic, quick-witted, and had recently married a woman named Emily. Emily, just 29, was the picture of charm, always ready with a story or compliment, eager to help, but with an ambition and energy that sometimes felt, to Melissa, slightly edged. On the surface, Melissa and Emily's relationship was friendly, if sometimes tinged with a competitive undercurrent. Emily, new to the family, often sought Melissa's advice about career moves, parenting questions, even little things like organizing family get-togethers. Melissa gladly obliged, wanting to support her sister-in-law and keep harmony intact. It was at one of Tom's family's regular Sunday dinners, with laughter echoing from the backyard and the scent of grilled corn drifting through the windows, that Emily first pulled Melissa aside. "I've been meaning to talk to you," she said brightly, her hazel eyes shining with excitement. She spoke in hushed, conspiratorial tones, hinting at a business idea she was eager to share, but too nervous to unveil in front of the whole family. Melissa, always open and empathetic, listened intently, eager to encourage her sister-in-law's entrepreneurial spirit. That evening, as fireflies danced in the yard and Ethan drifted off to sleep on Tom's shoulder, Melissa felt a small surge of pride, grateful for the trust Emily seemed to place in her, and for the sense of belonging she felt within the family. She had no way of knowing, in that golden twilight, just how much this latest connection, this almost sisterly bond, would come to define the most tumultuous chapter of her life. In these moments, all seemed right. The comfort of family, the hope for new opportunities, and the gentle assurance that love and trust would always guide her steps. Everything was about to change, but on that ordinary Sunday, Melissa could only sense the promise of a new beginning. The trust shattered. The first crack in Melissa's carefully crafted world appeared like a hairline fracture across glass. Subtle at first, but growing, relentless. It started with an excited phone call from Emily, Tom's sister-in-law, whose eagerness seemed contagious. Emily spoke of a once-in-a-lifetime business venture, a tech startup designed to disrupt the market. Backed by a charismatic founder she claimed to have met at a regional entrepreneurship conference. Emily was persuasive, painting pictures of financial freedom and family legacy. She told Melissa, "We could do this together, just us. It's a chance to secure our kids' futures." The sincerity in her voice was disarming. Melissa, who'd watched Emily hustle for years but never break through, empathized with the dream. She agreed, almost instinctively, to back Emily, lending most of the Carters' liquid savings in portions from their joint account, with Tom's reluctant but trusting nod of approval. For weeks, Emily's updates were frequent and hopeful. Emails about prototype development, photos of supposed team meetings, and even a slick pitch deck. Melissa traced her own name, typed under founding investors, feeling both proud and uneasy. She'd committed everything for family, a familiar value, but now it demanded more than casseroles at Sunday dinners. Then came the silence. Emily stopped responding to texts, her phone going straight to voicemail. Weeks turned into a month. Anxiety gnawed at Melissa. She reached out to the startup founder, only to discover the emails were fakes, the photos, stock images. The whole venture had never existed. Melissa's heart sank as the realization dawned. Emily, her trusted confidant, once considered like a sister, had orchestrated it all. By the time Tom saw the draining accounts and asked questions, the damage was irreversible. The weight of betrayal pressed heavier than the financial loss. She'd staked her standing in the family, her marriage, and her sense of judgment on Emily's word. And now, she was left with nothing but hollow explanations and a growing storm of doubt from those she loved most. The weight of doubt and isolation. Melissa had always believed that the bonds of family could withstand any storm. But as the reality of her financial loss became apparent, it wasn't just her savings that evaporated. It was also the certainty that those bonds were unbreakable. The aftermath of Emily's betrayal hit like a cold front, settling into every crevice of Melissa's once bright home and chilling even the simplest moments with unease. The questions began quietly enough. A lingering pause in a conversation with Tom, a sidelong glance at dinner, the hint of accusation in his softened tone. "Are you sure Emily gave you the whole story?" he'd ask, his words edged with worry and doubt. Melissa tried to answer, to explain, but each attempt tangled her deeper in her own guilt and confusion. Tom was hurting too, his trust in his own brother's wife wounded, his faith in his own judgment shaken. What began as concern soon curdled into silence, and the once easy camaraderie between them became tinged with unspoken accusations. Beyond her immediate family, the ripples spread. Tom's parents, once so warm and welcoming, now regarded her with cool politeness when they met. Family chat threads grew quieter when Melissa joined in. At Sunday dinners, she noticed how conversations drifted away when she entered the room, laughter dying off before she had the chance to join in. Her nephew, whose birthday she'd organized just months earlier, now responded to her texts with one-word answers, if at all. Some part of Melissa wanted to scream, to demand someone, anyone, believe her, to sit everyone down and show them how their suspicious stares felt like shrapnel. But a heavier part of her understood. The losses were real, and even if the Carters never said anything aloud, they were blaming her for trusting Emily, for risking their sense of security on a wild gamble. She tried to reach out to Emily, still hoping, against reason, that there was some explanation. Every attempt, email, text, social DM, came back void. The sense of desertion gnawed at Melissa's already raw nerves. The woman she'd championed, confided in, was gone, and all that remained were the echoing questions from her own son. "Why is everyone so sad, Mommy?" Melissa tried to shield Ethan as best she could, putting on brave faces for drop-offs and bedtime stories, fighting tears as she folded his clothes. The house didn't feel like a home anymore. Every polished surface seemed to reflect her perceived failure. Even her work life suffered, as she found it harder to focus, her confidence shaken whenever she looked at the spreadsheets and marketing plans that had once brought her pride. Isolation became both a shield and a prison. Melissa spent more time retreating into herself, reluctant to reach out even to her old friends back in Nebraska. What could she possibly say that would make sense of this mess? Phone calls went unanswered. Emails languished in drafts. She moved through the weeks like a shadow, her spirit dulled by the constant current of suspicion and self-blame. Tom tried, in his way, to help, but their conversations became transactional. Bills, groceries, Ethan's upcoming school events. Nothing deeper. The warmth between them, that spark that made even mundane chores feel special, was missing. Sometimes Melissa wondered if she could ever get it back, or if the fracture ran too deep. The walls she had built for trust and safety felt like they were closing in, brick by lonely brick. Despite the suffocating atmosphere, a stubborn ember inside her refused to go out. When the world had written her off, Melissa began, quietly, to take stock. She started keeping detailed notes, scribbling in the margins of her planner, scrolling back through old emails from Emily, comparing dates and stories. She Googled the names Emily had mentioned, traced every thread, even when those searches led nowhere. But for now, in this lowest valley, Melissa was alone. The woman who'd once united everyone at the family table, who'd built a life with empathy and resolve, sat in the cool evening light, watching the sun slip beneath the Denver rooftops, and wondered how she'd ever find her way back. Plunging into the abyss, there came a night in late October when Melissa hit rock bottom, a point beyond which she wasn't sure she'd be able to climb back. Denver's first snowstorm of the season blanketed the city, making the world outside shrink and silence itself in white. Melissa sat alone by the window, the amber glow of a street lamp slicing across the living room. Ethan was asleep. Tom was working late, and the world, she felt, had moved on without her. Every loss she'd suffered seemed to echo in the empty quiet. The family who now held her at arm's length, the husband she couldn't reach, the trust she'd ruined with one desperate leap of faith. Even her work, the place she'd so often turned for pride and affirmation, now felt like a stage set for constant self-doubt. She replayed every detail from months before, analyzing conversations, recalling Emily's laughter, the cloudless optimism of those early startup talks. What signs had she missed? Was she complicit in her own downfall? The questions never ended. Melissa hardly ate. Some days passed in gray detachment. Others were spent anxiously pacing the house, dreading her own thoughts. She couldn't bring herself to call her parents in Nebraska, or even respond to emails from old friends. To talk about her life now would mean owning her failures out loud, and that kind of exposure felt impossible. One particularly cold morning, after a sleepless night, she found herself staring at the bathroom mirror, searching for a version of herself she still recognized. "How did I get here?" she whispered, not expecting an answer. Her resilience, so steadfast through career setbacks, family squabbles, and early adult missteps, felt paper thin. All the careful stitching of her life had unraveled. What remained was barely hanging on. That day, Ethan asked her, "Mom, why don't we see Grandma and Grandpa anymore?" It was the first time Melissa let herself cry in front of her son. Through the tears, she managed a broken, "Sometimes people just need a little time." She wondered, as icy rain began to drum the windows, if time might mean forever. The loneliness pressed in, not just from the loss of relationships, but from the absence of hope itself. She moved through rituals, packing lunches, doing laundry, on autopilot, keeping Ethan's life running when her own felt stuck on pause. The sense of exile from her chosen family and her own home was sometimes overwhelming. In rare moments of peace, She tried to meditate, stare at the snow, or write in a tattered notebook. She'd cataloged every loss, every unanswered question, hoping that, in the pages, she might stumble on something resembling closure. But closure was nowhere to be found, just memories of happier days, the occasional hollow text from a distant friend, and the echo of Ethan's questions about why everything was different now. Her world had become small, cold, and defined by absence of trust, of love, of identity. Yet, somewhere deep, in the cracks left by heartbreak, a spark flickered. She didn't know what she would do next, or if she even had the strength to try. But the betrayal that broke her was also making her examine every inch of the darkness around her. And maybe, just maybe, she would one day find a path back to herself. Rising, unbreakable. Incredibly, the shift began on an utterly unremarkable morning, when an unfamiliar sense of clarity pierced the clouds that had long weighed down on Melissa's mind. She stood in the doorway, watching Ethan, bundled in a puffy coat, wrestling determinedly with a tangle of bootlaces. And it struck her. Everything she had built, everything that mattered, rested not on the opinions or judgments of others, but on the love and determination she could summon from within. Melissa resolved, with fresh defiance, not to let her story end in quiet defeat. She began by cataloging every piece of evidence related to Emily's betrayal. Emails, bank statements, phone records. If her trust had been used as a weapon against her, then facts and persistence would be her armor for the battles to come. Each evening, as Ethan colored at the table, Melissa revisited her notebook and planner, reconstructing the timeline, highlighting inconsistencies in Emily's pitch and communications, consulting legal guides online, and even contacting the authorities for advice. Learning to advocate for herself was not a linear path. Doubt and exhaustion still shadowed her days, but little victories began to emerge. A neighbor offering a kind word about her resilience, a colleague quietly expressing faith in her integrity, a warm conversation with Ethan's teacher, reminding her that her worth extended far beyond a single calamity. Melissa leaned into these moments, using them to patch the holes in her self-image and fuel her next steps. At work, she started slowly asserting herself again, guided by the principle that her professional acumen survived even her worst days. She put forth new ideas in meetings, volunteered to troubleshoot campaigns in crisis, and, within weeks, found her expertise restoring the confidence of her team. There was no miracle fix, but the deliberate act of showing up, of demonstrating competence and compassion, even while wounded, began to shift the tide. Behind the scenes, Melissa's case against Emily found traction. She collected affidavits, tracked financial activity, and coordinated with law enforcement, never broadcasting her efforts to the family, but letting the process unfold as it needed to. Some who had doubted her at first grew quiet in the face of mounting evidence. Melissa didn't revel in their discomfort. Instead, she focused on the satisfaction of reclaiming her truth piece by piece. In time, the Carter's extended family was forced to acknowledge the weight of Melissa's courage. When the truth finally broke, as incontrovertible as the first ray of spring sunlight through melting snow, Emily was confronted with her actions, and Melissa stood at the center, not as a victim, but as the unwavering force that had fought her way out of the dark. Most importantly, Melissa found herself healing in ways she'd never predicted. She reconnected with friends in Nebraska, sent handwritten letters to her parents, and began organizing small gatherings in her Denver neighborhood again. She and Tom, after many honest and painful conversations, rebuilt the bridge between them, brick by brick. Trust took time, but it was real, tempered by fire, and rebuilt on choice, not obligation. Melissa never again doubted the importance of self-trust. Her story, once defined by betrayal, transformed into a powerful testimony of resilience. She became more patient, more discerning, and fiercely protective of her own boundaries. For Ethan, she modeled the lesson that life's greatest storms are survivable, and that sometimes facing them head-on not only reveals what has been lost, but also lights the way toward all that might be gained. The spectacular unmasking time, as it often does, proved to be both an adversary and an unlikely ally for Melissa. After months of determined investigation, her dedication began to bear fruit. Slowly, but unmistakably, the fragments of evidence she'd so obsessively gathered started to form a coherent tapestry, a narrative that pointed not to her failures, but directly to Emily's orchestrated deception. Each scrap told a piece of the story. The fake business emails traced to anonymous domains, transfers routed through shadowy accounts, and the trail of fabricated startup documents that collapsed under the scrutiny of outside eyes. Staring at her collected evidence late into countless weary nights, Melissa realized the magnitude of what she'd uncovered. The time for quietly suffering had ended. It was time for the truth to storm out of the shadows. But for Melissa, revealing the truth was more than a matter of vindication. It was a pivotal moment for reclaiming her dignity and voice. She meticulously organized her findings, color-coded binders, timelines, printed correspondence matched with bank statements. Each detail was reviewed again and again, not out of paranoia, but to ensure that when the time came, her case was watertight. She rehearsed what she would say, practiced in front of her reflection until her trembling could no longer overpower her resolve. The risk was enormous, but so too was her newfound courage. She realized that no matter the cost, protecting herself, and perhaps others, from further harm was worth the leap. The stage for her unmasking came on an ordinary Sunday evening, bookending the kind of weekend that would have seemed beautiful in another era. Tom's family gathered for dinner, each member bustling through the familiar choreography of setting dishes, pouring wine, and passing stories across the long oak table. But beneath the cheerful din, tension lingered, a barely contained hush that had marked every family event since the betrayal came to light. Melissa arrived, evidence clutched tight, every step from the door to the kitchen, anchoring her in the purpose she'd painstakingly built. She waited until after dinner, when laughter had faded into casual conversation. Clearing her throat, her voice steadier than she'd dared hope, she asked for everyone's attention. Her heart thundered behind her ribs as the conversations dimmed and faces turned towards her. Tom's brows knitting in curiosity, Josh draping an arm protectively around Emily, and Tom's parents pursing their lips in uneasy expectation. Melissa didn't launch into accusation. Instead, she handed out copies of her evidence, each set tailored to the recipient. A gesture at once methodical and deeply human. She stood at the head of the table, flipping through her own packet, carefully guiding them all through the timeline. The moment Emily first pitched her scheme, the gradual siphoning of money, the fraudulent emails, the suspiciously altered documents. Whenever a voice rose with a question or comment, Melissa held her ground, answering clearly and calmly, referring back to her evidence, refusing to be derailed. Emily's mask began to crack almost immediately. Where she had once been all shining charm and composure, now she grew pale, her words tumbling over themselves, objection after objection ringing more hollow, each time Melissa quietly provided another irrefutable fact. Tom's parents, caught between shock and growing horror, turned repeatedly to the packets in their hands. Tom, eyes shining with a complex brew of love, regret, and outrage, listened raptly, his faith in his wife reawakening as the truth blazed forth. By the time Melissa finished, the air hung silent and desperate, broken only by Ethan's quiet fidgeting in the living room and the autumn wind sighing outside the window. The truth was undeniable. Emily sputtered explanations, misunderstandings, pressures. It was never supposed to go this far, but the evidence murdered doubt. Under the force of Melissa's courage and clarity, Emily's facade collapsed altogether, and with it, she lost the last pretense of control. For Melissa, standing in the center of the storm felt surreal. So many nights she'd rehearsed this confrontation, fearing failure or worse, yet now she discovered a perfect, necessary stillness. She did not revel in Emily's disgrace. Rather, her overwhelming feeling was relief. Relief that the burden of silence was at last lifted, that she could breathe again without the weight of undeserved shame. She knew, too, that this victory was only the first step. In the days to come, Emily would face legal repercussions, and Melissa would confront the long process of rebuilding damaged trust with Tom and the wider family. But as she gazed around at the stunned, saddened faces of people she still loved, she understood that, perhaps for the first time in a long time, she had truly done right by herself. The winds of change swept through the Carters' lives in the weeks that followed. There were uncomfortable conversations, apologies whispered and sobbed, new boundaries drawn, and old wounds aired. Melissa bore it all with a grace she never would have believed herself capable of in the lonely, haunted days that had come before. The world could be unfair, family bonds could be tested, and trust could be shattered. But there was nothing that required her to carry the blame for another's misdeeds. Her spectacular unmasking echoed not just through the Carter family, but the broader community. Friends who'd pulled away reached out once more, uncertain and tentative. But Melissa greeted them not with bitterness, but with a cautious hope. She shared her story, not the pain alone, but the lessons wrung from it. With anyone who needed to know, they too could survive betrayal. And in those moments, her journey transformed from a desperate fight for survival to a legacy of resilience, truth-telling, and unshakable self-worth. Melissa's story was far from over, but that Sunday evening would forever mark the night she rewrote its arc. Not as a silent victim, but as a woman bold enough to bring the shadows into the light, no matter how fierce the glare. Vengeance and rebirth. Melissa Carter stood at the threshold of a new chapter, one forged in the fire of betrayal, but now shaped by her own relentless spirit. In the wake of Emily's public unmasking and the whirlwind that followed, there was no miraculous restoration. Nothing about her journey had been easy or simple. This was the moment for something more than vindication. It was the moment for rebirth, and if vengeance was a part of that, Melissa would not shrink from it any longer. The aftermath of the confrontation was messy and exhausting. Emily wasn't just shunned socially. She was subject to a formal investigation. Melissa, who had once trembled at the thought of conflict, navigated meetings with lawyers and detectives with a patience and clarity she hadn't known she possessed. She participated in the unraveling of Emily's lies, providing documentation, clarifying timelines, and facing, without flinching, the uncomfortable questions of law enforcement. The legal process moved slowly, bureaucratic wheels grinding through hearings, paperwork, and interviews. Tom's family, now racked with shame and regret, teetered between reaching out to Melissa with clumsy apologies and retreating in awkward silence. But Melissa, instead of waiting for reconciliation or relying on the opinions of others, focused on fighting for justice. She followed up tirelessly with the district attorney. She sat in the gallery during Emily's hearing, jaw set, eyes clear, refusing to let her ex-sister-in-law's attempts at apology or manipulation sway her resolve. You don't get to use love as a shield, she thought. Each time, Emily looked her way with pleading eyes. This was not revenge for its own sake. Melissa understood that justice, in its purest sense, was not about erasing what had happened, but ensuring it wouldn't happen again, to her or anyone else. If her story could be a warning or a lesson in resilience to another woman left in the dark after trusting too freely, then she would bear its cost with pride. She gave interviews to local journalists, discussed financial fraud and the cost of misplaced trust on women's empowerment podcasts, and wrote op-eds about the need to create systems of protection and education for those vulnerable to such betrayals. Her pain became a platform, her vulnerability a weapon far sharper than bitterness. Rebuilding her life meant more than legal victories. Melissa had to reconstruct her sense of self from the ground up. She changed the locks on her house, not just literally, but figuratively as well. She set new, firmer boundaries with Tom and the extended family. Hard conversations were had, especially with Tom, as the truth finally settled between them. There were nights they cried together about everything lost, innocence, trust, the ease of their marriage, and nights when anger and fear flared, not at one another, but at the wounds left behind. Melissa did not let either emotion rule. Instead, she insisted on honesty. If their marriage was to survive, it had to be built on intentional trust, not blind faith. Melissa also reached out to the communities she had neglected during her hardship. She returned to her old book club in Denver, at first tentative and almost embarrassed. To her relief, the women there greeted her with open arms, some quietly sharing their own stories of betrayal, financial, emotional, or otherwise. Melissa was surprised to discover how many had struggled in silence. These evenings, around mugs of tea and stacks of novels, became a lifeline. Solidarity became its own kind of therapy. She wrote letters to her parents and to friends back in Nebraska, explaining the storm that had passed without painting herself as a victim. The act of writing, recounting details, acknowledging mistakes, accepting her own resilience, was its own salve. Slowly, her circle widened again. She organized potlucks in her neighborhood, no longer shying away from small talk or prying gazes. With each encounter, she learned a little more about how to be herself in a world that had once felt unsafe. Professionally, Melissa channeled her ordeal into newfound ambition. She put herself forward at work, pitching strategies based on crisis adaptation and honest communication. Her marketing presentations grew bolder, and her reputation for empathy and clarity brought fresh opportunities. Before long, her boss asked her to lead a mentorship program for young women in the company, an invitation she accepted with a pride unmarred by self-doubt. She initiated workshops on financial literacy and emotional boundary setting, eager to ensure no one else in her orbit was left defenseless. Through it all, her role as a mother gave her clarity and courage. She spoke to Ethan about kindness and boundaries, answering his innocent questions with open simplicity. Sometimes people we love make mistakes, and it hurts, but we can learn and grow, and it will make us stronger. Watching her son adapt, his trust in her unbroken, his affection steadfast, reminded Melissa of what truly mattered. The home was filled not with echoes of loss, but with new laughter, warmth, and the certainty that together they could face whatever came next. And Tom, her partner through disaster and renewal, emerged from the ordeal changed too. They rebuilt their marriage slowly, brick by brick, learning to ask for what they needed and to listen better than ever before. They attended counseling together, not just for repair, but for growth, determined to write the next chapter together as equals. As news of Emily's conviction and restitution orders spread, Melissa was approached by others seeking advice. Former acquaintances, strangers, even a few quietly desperate relatives of Emily's victims reached out for guidance. She took these meetings, sometimes over coffee, sometimes by email, always with honesty and a willingness to share both pain and hope. The woman who had once shrunk from attention now stood tall, her scars visible, but her head unbowed. Melissa's pursuit of justice did not erase her ordeal, but it imbued it with meaning. The vengeance she found was not in punishing Emily, though the sentence and financial restitution offered closure, but in the restoration of her life, in the forging of a whole new sense of self. She was no longer defined by what had happened to her, but by what she chose to do next. In every sense, this was rebirth. She shed old habits of people-pleasing and replaced them with discernment and courage. She forgave herself for trusting Emily, accepting that loving is never a mistake. Only forgetting one's own worth may be. She learned to trust again, not naively, but with eyes open and boundaries strong. The final act of closure came one spring afternoon, as Melissa sat under a blooming cherry tree outside the courthouse after Emily's sentencing. She watched petals fall, mingling with sunlight and fresh hope. There was no grand epiphany, but a steady, quiet peace. The knowledge that while wounds may linger, so too does strength. She called her mother, her voice light for the first time in months, and told her, "I made it through, not because I had to, but because I decided I was worth saving." And so, Melissa Carter's story no longer ended with betrayal. It began anew, with vengeance that brought justice, and with the sort of rebirth only possible after walking through fire. She spent her days living brightly, her laughter ringing louder, her boundaries firmer, and her love, both for herself and for those she allowed close, deeper and more steadfast than ever before.